Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the Presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Theodore Roosevelt, and the focus is Go Navy. The year is 1897. Roosevelt is still 4 years away from the presidency, but he's a politician on the rise and has been since a pretty early age. If you recall, he started out in politics as a state assemblyman in the state of New York at the age of 23. He then jumped to Washington, where he became a member of the Civil Service Commission under President Harrison and Cleveland. Then it was back to New York, where he became the police commissioner of New York City. Some common themes in some of these early jobs that Roosevelt had in his political career. He was a committed reformer. He took on the biggest challenges there were, and he did it in many times for a righteous reason. Sort of the righteousness of good versus evil was what promoted Roosevelt, and once he got going, there was little that could stop him. As a result, he made a lot of friends. He certainly got his name in the paper. He also ruffled feathers. He made some enemies along the way, which is one of the reasons why he didn't stay in some of these positions all that long. And that's what was happening in New York City. So when 1896 rolled around and it's time for another presidential election, Roosevelt gets on board. He stumps for the Republican nominee, William McKinley. McKinley wins the presidency, and Roosevelt's thinking, here's his ticket back to another job, back to Washington, somewhere in the administration. So he looks for help. He calls on his friend Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, now a member of Congress, to start trying to convince McKinley to bring Roosevelt into the administration. Now, McKinley's not so sure. William McKinley was extraordinarily well liked and didn't like people necessarily who ruffled feathers, and so he had heard the stories about Roosevelt and had concerns. But Roosevelt was saying all the right things in lobbying for the job. So it was really up to McKinley and John Long, who was the Secretary of the Navy, to make this decision. And Roosevelt wanted to make it known that he would do anything that the administration wanted. In fact, he makes a note, rather sort of in form of supplication, which is very unusual for Roosevelt, that he says, if I am offered it, I shall work hard and shall stay at Washington, hot weather or any other weather. And whenever he wants me to stay there or go wherever he sends me, my aim should be solely to make his administration a success. Now he's talking about both President McKinley and his immediate boss to be John Long. As after they talked about it, they realized that Roosevelt can be an asset, and they make him the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Now, one of the reasons he got the Navy opportunity is that he had written a book coming out of college on the Naval War of 1812. Turned out to be a pretty definitive work at a very detailed level. It was popular in Britain. It was popular with the U.S. Navy. And so he had some qualifications for the Navy from that historical background. But he was also part of a new generation of American thinkers on geopolitical matters, that he saw an expansive opportunity for the United States as a source of good for the rest of the world, as well as an economic power and potentially a military power that could have a lot of influence beyond the borders of the United States. And he started to find some common cause with some people who felt the same way. One of them was Captain Alfred Mahan. Mahan, who was currently working at the U.S. Naval Academy, he had just written his definitive work on naval history across the world, and Mahan invites Roosevelt to come and speak at the first commencement under his job as Assistant Secretary for the folks at the Naval Academy who are about to launch into their professional careers. Roosevelt tells them, "We ask for a great Navy. We ask for an armament fit for the nation's need, not primarily to fight, but to avert fighting. Preparedness deters the foe and maintains right by the show of ready might without the use of violence. Peace through strength, but also that theme of speak softly and carry the big stick," which Roosevelt became famous for. In many cases, the Navy was his big stick. Now, he wasn't new to the fact of trying to build a modern Navy. In fact, the previous presidents, dating back to Chester Arthur, Benjamin Harrison, Grover Cleveland, now McKinley, had all been working with Congress to finally build up the U.S. into a modern Navy. It was now coming online, battleships were part of the norm, and Roosevelt saw an opportunity to express this sense of power from the United States to have a greater standing in the world. Now, the biggest challenge for the United States from a foreign national standpoint was happening just 90 miles from American shores on the island of Cuba. Cuba was in the midst of yet another rebellion. Now, the Spanish had been the overlords of Cuba for centuries, but the Cuban people had been rising up sort of one after another, wanting their independence from their European overseer. And this was another of those cases. It started in the mid-1990s under President Cleveland, who had kind of stayed away, but a lot of forces pushing President McKinley to get involved. The Spanish were suppressing the rebels. They built concentration camps, and the locals were starving and dying, and these horrific stories were coming to the American shores, which was so close by, and there was a lot of momentum for the U.S. to engage. Now, this would be completely counter to American foreign policy dating back to George Washington. From the very beginning of the Republic, the American leaders had decided neutrality was the way to go, to stay out of entangling alliances. And if there's nearby fights or fights far away, allies, foes, doesn't matter, let them deal with their own business. We have enough problems on our own hand. But there was a mood change going on in the United States as we got close to the 20th century, and there was a feeling to get more involved. And Theodore Roosevelt was a big proponent of that because he saw the U.S. as a source of good in the world. Well, President McKinley is not so sure. He's a little more cautious, and he's trying to negotiate with the Spanish on behalf of the Cuban rebels. He's not getting very far. But then a catalytic moment happens. February 15th, 1898. The United States had sent a naval battleship to Havana Harbor in Cuba. It was the USS Maine. Now, this was not an uncommon thing to do. Oftentimes, U.S. naval vessels would stop in port in various Caribbean islands, so there was nothing terribly unusual about this. But what happened on February the 15th was certainly unusual because the Maine exploded. It exploded and went to the bottom of Havana Harbor, and more than 200 American sailors died on the spot. Now, there were headlines across the United States immediately blaming Spain, including quotes from the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, that basically was saying it's time for war to go back against the Spanish. The administration wasn't quite as far ahead as Roosevelt was. President McKinley was certainly outraged by the act, but he wanted an investigation before he was ready to declare war or go after Spain from a military standpoint. So that investigation was underway, but Theodore Roosevelt wasn't really inclined to wait. About 10 days after the explosion that sent the Maine to the bottom of the harbor, Secretary Long had left Roosevelt in charge of the Navy. This was not all that unusual, where he would be the acting secretary for a brief period of time. Well, on this occasion, Roosevelt decided to take matters into his own hands. He sends out orders to Commodore George Dewey, who's overseeing the American fleet based in Asia, and says, I want everybody in Hong Kong, all the ships loaded up, ready to go. In case we declare war, your mission will be to go take care of the Spanish fleet in Asia, currently based in the Philippines. But Roosevelt didn't stop there. In a letter to his friend Leonard Wood, he notes that I have done what I thought ought to be done. I have placed various ships in commission with orders to be ready for at once. I have given large orders for the purchase and shipment of coal. I have assembled supplies and forwarded munitions. In other words, I have done everything I can to get the Navy ready. I may not be supported, but I have done what I know to be right. Someday they will understand. Now, Theodore Roosevelt was never one to really ask for permission. Maybe he'd ask for forgiveness after the fact, but he wasn't one to ask for permission when he knew it was something that was right. Although this was fairly outrageous behavior for an assistant secretary to take so much lead in preparations without involving a secretary who was just taking a few days off. So when Secretary Long comes back, he rebukes Roosevelt. He's outraged at the boldness that Roosevelt would do to take this under his own authority. But interestingly, Long doesn't change any of the orders because he's also inclined to believe that war is coming, and he finds the moves prudent. He just didn't really like the way his subordinate went about it. Well, and finally, in late March of 1898, that investigative report from the Navy comes back, and while it didn't conclude who caused the damage to the Maine, they did say that there was an explosion below the waterline that created a chain of events that eventually exploded the munitions on board and brought the ship to the bottom of the harbor. At a minimum, though, they blamed Spain for not policing the harbor. So even though if they couldn't say that Spain had actually planted the explosive device, they said it was at least Spain's responsibility for police a harbor, and the American ships suffered under their watch. Well, President McKinley was now finally getting close to being ready to ask for a declaration of war. He tries a few last-minute negotiations with the Spanish, but the trust is not there, and it doesn't go very far. So in early April 1898, McKinley asks for and gets from Congress a declaration of war against Spain. So the bureaucracy starts to mobilize. The Army, the Navy, to get not only the people, but also the supplies and the ships and everything ready to go. But Theodore Roosevelt is not part of that because he has other plans for his role in the Spanish-American War, but that's the story for another day. For now, that is Theodore Roosevelt, and Go Navy, from the life of Theodore Roosevelt. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.